Well, some of the things that people have remarked on in my work arise from this method of thinking, which I'm only addressing because, you selected the absurd notion of spending 2 days thinking about the thought of Stuart Hall. So I've been thinking a bit about the thought of Stuart Hall too. And I'm telling you, what I seem to have found out. So certain habits of thinking, certain ways of going about a problem. If you're not interested in the disciplines, and if your subject isn't given by the disciplines, what is it that you're trying to find out about? Well, David Scott, in his wonderful paper, I nearly said when David is finished, we can go home now, because we know all you never need to know about the thought of Stuart Hall, and I know a great deal than I knew before he started. But he said, well, I'm addressing the question of what he called the contingency of the present. Now, actually, I wouldn't put it that way myself, although I understand perfectly well why he put it that way. I would say that the object of my study is not sociology or cultural studies or anthropology or literature, etc. The object of my intellectual work, insofar as I'm intellectual, is what I would call the present conjuncture. It's the history of the present. It's what is the condition in which we now find ourselves, and how did we get there, and what forces are creating it in order that we might understand how we might do something about it. Now, David, of course, was absolutely right to say, in thinking the history of the present, which is a kind of Foucauldian way of talking about that, which I point out to you something extremely important. It brings together two rather contradictory ideas. The history of the present. The present sound as if, it's very presentist in its implication. Right now, what is happening to us right now, what confronts us immediately now as what he described as dangerous and difficult times. And yet the history of the present commits us to thinking of that as something which has anterior conditions of existence which we have to understand. So the present, of course, is a force we have to now transform, but nevertheless we have to understand the conditions under which it came into existence. The history of the present. The question of thinking the contingency of the history of the present is because it's not so much my object, but what I always want to say about the present. And now I try to move to the second part of what I want to say, and here I'm simply going to try to identify a certain number of ideas or themes which have emerged in the course of what people have said, and just make a few brief remarks about them and pass on. Contingency. Why contingency? What is it that I've been wanting to say about contingency? I don't want to say about contingency, of course, that the world has no pattern, that it has no structure, that it has no shape. But I do want to say that its future is not already wrapped up in its past. There is no closure yet written into it. And to be absolutely honest, if you don't agree that there is a degree of openness or contingency to every historical conjuncture, you don't believe in politics. You don't believe in anything that can be done. For if it is already given, what is the point of exercising yourself about trying to change it in a particular direction? This is a dilemma which lies, of course, right at the heart of classical Marxism. If the laws of history are about to unfold, who cares about the class struggle? Just let them unfold. And there's a whole series of kinds of Marxism which were precisely mechanistic and in that way. Let the laws of capital unfold. Contingency does drive you to say, of course, these are not forces. The forces at work in any particular conjuncture, are not just random. They're formed up out of history. They're quite particular and specific, and you have to understand what they are. But what is the outcome of the struggle between those different contending relations of forces is not yet given. It has something to do with how that particular contest will be conducted. Now, just listen to what I said. It's extremely determinate, but it is not determined. My job has been to try to think what determination means without what determinacy means without determination. I don't believe it is already determined, but I do believe that all the forces at work in a particular historical conjuncture or a situation one is trying to analyze or a phase of history or development one is trying to unravel, I do believe those forces are determinate. They don't arise out of nowhere. They arise out of specific conditions of existence. So what is the way of thinking a determinateness which is not a closed determinacy? And contingency is the sign of this effort to think determinateness without a closed form of determination. In the same way, people say, yeah, you know, you are a conjuncturalist. You know, you think what you say is you want to analyze not long epochal sweeps of history, but you want to analyze specific conjunctures. Why the emphasis on the conjunctures? Why the emphasis on what is historically specific? Well, it has exactly to do with what I've been talking about already. A conjuncture is simply the fact that very dissimilar currents, some of a long duration, some of a relatively short duration, tend to fuse or condense at particular moments into a particular configuration. And it's that configuration with its balance of forces which, as it were, is the object of one's analysis or intellectual inquiry. And the importance about a conjuncture is its historical specificity. That's to say, to put it very crudely, I'm not so interested in racism as I am in different racisms that arise in specific historical circumstances and their effectivity, their ways of operation. I'm less interested in capital or capitalism from, you know, the 17th century to now than I am in different forms of capitalism. I'm interested particularly just now in the enormously important shift in global capitalism which occurs in the 1970s. That's the end of what I would call one conjuncture, the conjuncture of the period of the post-war settlement, dominated largely, especially in Europe, by social democratic balance of forces, to the rise of neoliberalism, of global capitalism, of a new kind, of all the forms of globalization which have come to dominate the modern world, the contemporary world. That is the move from one conjuncture to another. And what interests me is the forms, the new forms of global capitalism, the new forms of economic, geopolitical power which arise in that period, the new forms of the organization of power which arises, the kinds of things that Tony was beginning to address. I want to unravel what is specific about the moment from the mid-70s on. I want to know whether the period around 9/11, the period of the emergence of a single superpower, constitutes a new conjuncture or is simply a new, as it were, configuration within the old conjuncture. You know, why do I want to know this? Because I want to know what to do about it. I want to know how we are going to deal with it. And to know that is to know what forces are really active in this conjuncture. What is shaping it? What ideas shape it? Don't tell me, you know, the ideas of capitalism. You know, that is what Sartre once called lazy Marxism. You know, it's like saying, you know, Valery is a bourgeois poet, so he writes bourgeois poetry. It doesn't tell you anything. It tells you at the end what you knew at the beginning. What is the use of theory that tells you what you already knew? That is ideology. Ideology is recognition. Ah, yes, that's a great thought, and I had it yesterday. You know, it's of absolutely no purpose. It has no effectivity, you know. There's no guarantee that you will have the right thing, but at least adventure with some ideas to try to understand what is distinctively new about this new moment. What is distinctively new about the way ideas operate in it? How is power changing? How is even capital changing? How is the way in which societies which are now engrossed in new forms of global capitalist relations become complicit with their own exploitation, so that it is impossible any longer to say the line of division is between there and here, the West and the rest, the whites and the blacks, because there are some blacks who are subordinate functions right within the operation of global capital itself. This is a conjuncture that is extremely puzzling. We don't know how to understand it. We do not have any idea about how it actually operates. They don't know how it operates, so we certainly don't. And Gramsci once said, the purpose of analytic and intellectual work is that we have to be cleverer than them. If you want to change anything, they want it to go on as it is. They want to expand those relations forever. Under the new dispensation, we're told we've arrived at the end of history. There's nothing superior to the system of liberal democracy and global capitalism that we now have. We just need to give it as a beneficent award to the rest of the world. But the idea of transcending that to some other more complicated set of relations or some different set of relations, is a hopeless task. Well, that is to remain within the settled order of knowledge and understanding. Of course, intellectuals can do a great deal to help them to do that and have done so. The new economists, the managerialists, etc., their ideas pour into supporting and normalizing this new system of power. But that's not our business. Our business is to try to deconstruct that system. And therefore, we have to understand even better than they do how it operates, and you know why? Because the one thing that they will not look at so carefully are the contradictions which every system always produces, the things that it cannot cohere within its system of power, the thing that's always left out, that remains emergent or remains residual, the thing that's going to knock on the door of this particular system and say, you've left us out, how about us? And that is the constitutive outside that is going to disturb and unravel a particular paradigm of power and knowledge and move the conjuncture onto some other configuration. And that is the side of history that I happen to be on, and that is why I need the knowledge. That's why I need the understanding. And that, unfortunately, since it isn't the system as it remained, as it was in existence before, but is a new configuration, that is why you have to adventure in thought, including, I'm afraid, Charlie, you're quite right, being a bit eclectic, trying ideas out here. It doesn't work. You exaggerate them too much. You think, people have left out culture. You're absolutely certain that culture is not a residual but a constitutive category. How do you start to think that? Do you find yourself thinking too much in culturalist terms? Yes, of course, I hold my hands up, of course. In the period when I was trying to think about identity, I did make identity too voluntaristic. I did give it too culturalist an inflection. I didn't think sufficiently about the symbolic and material resources that are required to sustain identities and that embed identities in structures of power. I didn't think about that. Although I must say, I never had a purely voluntaristic conception of identity. I never thought people could just, like a smorgasbord, eat from one identity in the morning and another identity in the afternoon and another one in the bathroom and another one in the shower, etc., and be anybody you could. That is what I meant by postmodernist nomadism, and I never wanted that. Yeah? But what I always tried to say is that identities always have, they come into existence through particular roots, and those roots will mark them, they will limit them. And they will form them in a certain way. But there is a certain open-endedness to it. And when I say now, I was asking the question whether, as it were, one of the things that's distinctive about the modern world is precisely that whereas in the past the balance within identities has been largely the culture writing the script of individuals, we had moved to a moment when the emphasis was more on the capacity of people to have an element of choice, but the element of choice, is relatively restricted. I can't, except, unless I'm going to, escape into the wilds of fantasy, I am not a freeborn Englishman, and I cannot think the world in the position of a freeborn Englishman, The question is more, in exactly what way did I discover that I was black? I put it that way. You ask me why I need this notion of open-endedness. Well, No, I told you how I discovered I was a West Indian. Yeah? I wasn't born a West Indian. I discovered I was West Indian. And then I discovered I was black. I discovered I could call myself black. How did that happen? Well, it happened because of certain historical developments, which made the term, the conception of myself black, available to me in history. It happened because of civil rights. It happened because of the transformation of Jamaican society. It happened because the society that I left, which could not think of itself as black, though it certainly was, could, after the 60s, begin to think of itself as black in a different way. A different conception of blackness became available to the people. That was a cultural transformation, and I was able to become, to discover that that was what I really was. You might say, more fool you. How come you didn't know that? But this is because, your knowledge of yourself is never given simply by the circumstances in which you are born. They are constituted, as Althusser said, in imaginary lived relations. We live in an imaginary lived relationship to our real conditions of existence. We have to imagine them, to fantasize about them, to theorize about them, to represent them in order to live them. And so there are always changes in the ways in which we can figure ourselves. So I've emphasized the question you asked, why identity? I'm interested in identity because identity is some source of agency and action, because it's impossible for people to work and move and struggle and survive without investing something of themselves, of who they are in their practices and activities. And precisely because, historically, I thought, there had been an enormous waning and weakening in the given collective identities of the past, of class and tribe and ethnic group and so on, precisely because that world was now more open-ended, though, of course, it hasn't disappeared in any sense. So those constraints are still on any identity formation. But it seemed to me there was a relatively greater degree of openness in the balance between the givenness of an identity and the capacity to construct it or make it. That's all that I'm registering. I was trying to register in the new work on identity. I always refused the notion that a whole politics could be identified with any one identity position. But I try to say that identity is always the product of identification. It is the product of taking a position, of staking a place in a certain discourse or practice, of saying, this is, for the moment, who I am and where I stand. And that positional notion of identity enables one then to speak from that place, to act from that place. Although sometime later, in another set of conditions, one may want to modify one's sense of who it is that is speaking. So in that sense, identity is not a closed book any more than history is a closed book, any more than subjectivity is a closed book, any more than culture is a closed book. It is always, as they say, in process. It is in the making. It's moving from a determinate past towards the horizon of a possible future which is not yet known.